Hey everyone, let's solve question 626, exchange seats. The question asks us to write an SQL query to swap the seat ID of every two consecutive students. If the number of students is odd, the ID of the last student is not swapped. The question goes on to say we need to return the result table ordered in ascending order of the column ID. So a fairly straightforward question. Let's try to understand the approach we can use by looking at the example provided. So we have the seat table, which is the input table, and we have 5 different students. So the first student is Abbott with the ID 1. The second student is Doris with the ID 2. If we have a look over to our output, desired output, we see that the IDs for student Abbott and Doris have been swapped. So Abbott now has the ID 2, Doris has the ID 1. This is a similar pattern with what happens for students Green and Emerson, where their IDs have been swapped. So Green is 3 and Emerson is 4. Finally, we notice that for student with an ID 5, there is no change or there's no swap that has happened because 5 is the last ID and it is an odd number. So as the question suggested, there is no swap that we need to do. Now, there are different ways to go ahead solving this question. We can use a lag or a lead function to find the next student or find the previous student. But there's a simple approach that I would prefer using. And that is first we need to find if the ID is even. So if an ID is even, we need to swap it with the previous ID. So if ID is even, we'll swap it with the previous ID. So this will now become 1. If the ID is odd and is not the last ID, so this is an odd ID and it's not the last ID, we need to swap this ID with the next ID. So this will now become 2. And the last case that we need to check is the ID is odd and is the last ID, we leave it unchanged. So we leave this unchanged. And that's the only 3 cases that we really need to check. So I'm going to start writing our query. So star is just our placeholder. I'm going to say orders by ID in ascending order. And the first case that we're going to write is when ID is even, I'm going to say, I'm going to find the previous ID. We need the previous ID, swap it with the previous ID, so ID minus 1. When ID is odd, when ID is odd, and actually to make our query easier, I'm going to take this as our second condition, where ID is odd and ID is equal to the last ID. So I'm going to write a subquery to find the last ID, max ID one seat. So this subquery is going to find our last ID, and if this last ID is equal to our if it's equal to our ID and it's an odd ID, we are going to leave it unchanged. And finally, I'm going to say else ID plus 1. So this is for the second condition where the ID is odd and we're going to swap it with the next ID. So we just have to increment the ID to swap it with the next ID. And finally, I'm going to say end alias this as ID and also select the column student. So this query should work. I'm going to try and run it. Okay, the test case has passed, and finally, if I submit it, this query should work as well. So the question is really about identifying these 3 cases, and then it becomes really easy. So as you see, the test cases have passed, and that's how you solve this question. Thank you, everyone.